The frost hadn't even cleared off the windshield yet, and Daniel Voss was already standing in the loan officer's parking lot, staring at a piece of paper that would decide the next 10 years of his life. Behind him sat 1,100 acres, corn, soybeans, a little wheat on the North 40, land his grandfather cleared with a team of horses, land his father nearly lost twice, once in the 80s, once in 2008, land that had never, not once, carried debt this size. In his hand, a financing approval for a new Massey Ferguson tractor package. 6 figures, second mortgage on the home quarter, his signature already dry, already final. The loan officer's words were still ringing in his ears. Daniel, I'll process this because it's your right, but I want it on record. I think this is a bad investment. A bad investment. On a Massey Ferguson. On the machine Daniel believed was about to save his operation, not sink it. He didn't argue. He just nodded, folded the paper, and walked out. Because Daniel Voss wasn't buying a tractor that morning. He was buying proof. 3 years earlier, the Voss operation was bleeding, quietly, the way most farms bleed. Not with one dramatic collapse, but with 100 small ones nobody talks about at the coffee shop. Fuel costs climbing, fertilizer prices doing things nobody in the county had a name for, and equipment, old, patched, and slower every season. Eating hours the operation didn't have. Daniel's father, Earl, had run the same fleet for almost 2 decades. Steady. Paid off. Boring. Earl believed in one rule above all others: never owe more than the ground can pay back in a bad year. Daniel believed in something else. He believed the old iron was the reason they were falling behind. Not the markets, not the weather, not the debt already on the books. The tractors, too slow across the field, too many repair bills eating into planting windows. Too many seasons where the neighbor 2 miles over finished 3 days ahead, sold into a better price window, and walked away with margin Daniel never saw. That neighbor ran Massey Ferguson. And every year, at the co-op, at the elevator, at the machinery auctions, Daniel watched that green and red fleet roll in ahead of schedule, finish ahead of schedule, and sell ahead of schedule, while his own harvest crawled to the finish line behind it. It wasn't just pride eating at him. It was arithmetic. Every day of delay meant selling into a market that had already moved against him. Every extra hour in the field meant burning fuel at a rate the old tractors were never designed for at their age. Every repair bill meant dollars that should have gone toward inputs, instead going toward parts that were getting harder to source every year the fleet aged. He started running numbers, real numbers, horsepower to acre ratios, fuel efficiency curves, field capacity math scratched onto the back of seed catalogs at midnight. He pulled old fuel receipts back 3 years and charted them against acres covered. He called 2 other operations, 2 counties over that had made the same jump, and asked them bluntly whether they regretted it. Neither did. Both told him the same thing. The first season is the hardest one to survive, and after that, the math finally starts working for you instead of against you. He wasn't dreaming, he was calculating, and the calculations said, upgrade, and the extra acres covered per day would pay the loan back inside 6 seasons. Stay put, and the slow bleed would eventually take the whole operation anyway, not in one dramatic year, but in the same quiet erosion that had already cost the Voss operation 200 acres of rented ground. The year prices got tight, and Daniel couldn't outbid a neighbor running newer, faster iron. The only problem was convincing anyone else of that math. Earl wasn't convinced. He'd survived 2 downturns by refusing exactly this kind of leverage, and as far as he was concerned, survival was its own proof. The bank wasn't convinced either. Rick Halbrook had watched enough young operators walk in with spreadsheets full of best-case assumptions to know that spreadsheets don't account for a snap PTO shaft in the middle of July. Daniel decided he didn't need them convinced. He needed them wrong. The loan officer, a careful man named Rick Halbrook, who'd sat across the table from 3 generations of Voss men, laid it out plainly the day Daniel brought in the equipment quote. Your yields have been average the last 2 years. Commodity prices are soft right now, not strong. You're asking to leverage the home quarter, the one piece of land with 0 debt on it, to finance a tractor package during a down cycle. I've seen this exact move end 2 ways, Daniel, and only one of them is good. Daniel didn't flinch. He'd expected resistance. What he hadn't expected was Rick sliding across a printed sheet, a breakdown of Daniel's own real numbers, corrected for the bank's more conservative commodity forecast. The revised numbers didn't pay back in 6 seasons. They paid back in 9, if nothing went wrong. "Nothing ever goes exactly right on 1,100 acres, Rick said. "You know that better than I do." Daniel took the sheet home. He didn't show his father. He didn't show his wife, Carrie, not that night anyway. He sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, running the numbers a third time, a fourth time, trying to find the version where Rick was wrong. He found it, a version where he pushed harder, planted earlier, ran longer hours, cut corners on the softer ground, and used the tractor's full capacity every single day it was in the shed instead of the field. A version that required everything to go right. He convinced himself that was still a plan. It wasn't a plan. It was a bet. The day Daniel drove to the dealership to finalize the order, Earl came with him, not to approve it, but because Earl said if his son was going to do something this reckless, he wasn't going to hear about it secondhand from the neighbors. The Massey Ferguson on the lot was everything the sales sheets promised. Wide stance, deep green paint still showing factory shine, a cab that sat above the yard like it already owned it. Daniel walked around it twice, ran his hand along the fender the way a man touches something he's about to marry. Earl stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing for a long moment. Then, "Your grandfather cleared that home quarter by hand. You understand that, right? You're putting a machine ahead of the ground that built this family." "I'm putting a machine behind the ground, Dad, to protect it. This is how we keep it." That's what every man says right before he loses it. The silence after that sat heavier than anything either man had said out loud. Daniel signed anyway. Word travels in farm country the way it always has, fast and rarely kind. By the time planting season opened, half the township knew Daniel Voss had mortgaged the home quarter for new iron, while the bank was on record calling it risky. At the co-op, men who used to nod at Daniel now studied him a little longer before saying anything at all. The real test came at planting. Daniel's neighbor, the one who'd been running Massey Ferguson for years, the one whose green fleet had haunted Daniel's coffee shop mornings, pulled into the same field road at the same hour, both men starting their season within sight of each other. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't watching someone else's dust from behind. He was running beside it. Acre for acre, hour for hour, the new Massey Ferguson held its own. Wider passes, steadier fuel burn, less time in the shed, and more time in the dirt. Where the old fleet used to force a stop every few hours to check a temperature gauge climbing too fast, the new machine just kept working, steady and unbothered, hour after hour. For 3 straight days, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit. He felt ahead. He caught himself, more than once, slowing down just to look back at the pass he'd just finished. Rows straight, ground turned evenly, no smoke trailing from an engine working harder than it should. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But after years of watching his equipment struggle to keep pace, there was something almost disorienting about finally being the one who wasn't falling behind. The neighbor noticed too, pulled his cap down, gave Daniel a look across the fence line that wasn't quite respect yet, but wasn't dismissal either. A few days in, he even pulled his truck over at the property line, rolled the window down, and said only, "Didn't expect you'd be keeping up this early." Daniel took it as the closest thing to a compliment the man had ever paid him. Daniel drove home that first week believing every hard number, every sleepless calculation, every silent argument with his father had been worth it. He called Carrie from the field to tell her they were ahead of pace. He didn't call Rick Halbrook, but he thought about it. Thought about how good it would feel to lay this exact week out on the loan officer's desk and watch the conservative projection crumble under real results. He should have known better than to believe anything that early in a season built on debt. It happened the way these things usually happen, not with warning, but with weather. A wet system rolled in 2 weeks after planting, dumping rain across the county for 4 straight days. Fields that were supposed to be drying out for early cultivation instead sat under standing water. And when the sun finally came back, it came back hard, cracking the topsoil, forcing a compressed window where every acre needed attention at once. This was the moment Daniel's plan required everything to go right. Instead, the transmission on the new tractor threw a fault code on day 2 of the compressed window, a rare but real mechanical hiccup, the kind that happens even on brand new equipment when it's pushed at the edge of its duty cycle for weeks without rest. The tractor sat in the dealership service bay for 6 days. 6 days during the single tightest window of the entire season. Daniel stood in that service bay watching a technician run diagnostics, arms crossed so tight his shoulders ached, asking the same question every 20 minutes. How much longer? The answer kept changing. A sensor issue became a wiring fault. The wiring fault became a control module that had to be ordered in from out of state. Each hour of delay felt personal, even though nobody in that shop had done anything but their job. He thought about the old fleet sitting idle back home, reliable in the sense that nothing on them could break that hadn't already broken twice before, which meant Daniel knew exactly how to fix them without waiting on a parts truck. For one bitter moment, standing under the fluorescent lights of that service bay, he almost wished he still had them. He didn't say that out loud to anyone. Not to the technician. Not to Carrie. Not to himself. More than once. For the first time since the loan office, Rick Halbrook's voice came back to him, clear as the day he said it. Nothing ever goes exactly right on 1,100 acres. Daniel's neighbor finished his fields that week. Sold into a price window that closed 3 days after Daniel finally got his machine back. The gap between them, the gap Daniel had spent 3 years trying to close, didn't just stay open, it widened. And it widened in the worst possible way, publicly. At the co-op that week, a man who'd never said 2 words to Daniel in his life asked, almost too casually, whether it was true the new tractor had already broken down. Daniel gave a short answer and left without buying what he'd come for. He wasn't ready yet to explain a season that had gone sideways before it had even had the chance to prove itself. Carrie found the loan paperwork the same week the tractor came back from the shop. She hadn't seen the full number before. Daniel had shown her the monthly payment, not the total exposure against the home quarter. The conversation that followed wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. You put our house up against a tractor, and you didn't think that was something I needed to know before you signed it? I didn't want you carrying the weight of it if it didn't need carrying. It needs carrying now, Daniel. Look at what's sitting in that shop bill. Earl didn't say I told you so. He didn't have to. He simply stopped bringing up the operation at all, which was worse, because Daniel had spent his whole life reading his father's silences, and this one said everything. For the first time, Daniel let himself consider the version of this story where Rick Halbrook had simply been right, where the numbers, corrected and conservative, had known something Daniel's midnight calculations refused to admit. That leverage doesn't ask when a season decides to go wrong. It just is or isn't there when the trouble shows up. He didn't sleep well that week, or the week after. By fall, the operation was in a place Daniel hadn't planned for. Behind on the calendar, carrying new debt, watching commodity prices sit exactly as soft as the bank had warned, and running a machine that had already cost him 6 critical days he could never get back. But here is where the story stopped being simple. Because in the second half of the season, once the transmission issue was resolved and the machine was back to full duty, the numbers Daniel had originally calculated started showing up in a different way. Wider passes across the back sections, fuel curves that held steady through long harvest days, field capacity that let Daniel run longer hours with less operator fatigue, which mattered more than he'd expected once the season stretched into its final grinding weeks. The neighbor's early lead in planning didn't fully carry through to harvest. A late-season equipment issue on the neighbor's older combine cost him nearly 4 days at a critical moment, the same kind of mechanical roulette that had hit Daniel earlier in the year, now landing somewhere else. Machinery, Daniel was learning the hard way, doesn't pick sides. It doesn't care whose loan is bigger or whose pride is on the line. It fails when it fails, on whichever operation happens to be running it that week, and the only real advantage belongs to whoever recovers the fastest. Daniel ran longer days than he ever had in his life that October. Up before the frost lifted, in the cab past dark, more nights than not, trading sleep for hours in the field because the season had left him no other currency to spend. Carrie brought meals out to the edge of the field some nights, rather than waiting for him to come in, and those quiet, wordless dinners on the tailgate became, strangely, some of the steadiest moments of that whole difficult year. Daniel finished his harvest 9 days later than his best-case projection, 4 days later than the neighbor. Not the humiliating gap the spring had suggested, not the victory Daniel had imagined signing that loan. Something narrower, something real, the kind of margin that doesn't make for a triumphant story at the co-op, but that keeps a banknote serviceable and a family's land in the family. When the final numbers came in, yield, price realized, total input cost, and the new loan payment sitting on top of everything else, Daniel sat down with Rick Halbrook one more time. Rick didn't gloat. That wasn't his way. He simply pulled up the original conservative projection, the 9-season payback estimate he'd handed Daniel that first meeting, and set it beside the actual first-year performance. The operation hadn't beaten the projection, but it hadn't collapsed under it either. The season landed almost exactly on Rick's conservative line, not the optimistic version Daniel dreamed up at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, but close enough to the real one that the loan stayed serviceable, the home quarter stayed in the family, and the machine mechanical hiccup included had done roughly what a Massey Ferguson at that horsepower class was supposed to do under real conditions. "You didn't prove me wrong," Rick said, "but you didn't prove yourself a fool either. That's rarer than people think." Daniel didn't feel triumphant hearing that. He felt something steadier, the particular unglamorous relief of a man who bet big and landed, barely, on the right side of a line he'd drawn himself. Earl came out to the shed the week after harvest wrapped, when the new Massey Ferguson sat washed down and parked for winter, mud still caked in the tread from the last hard pull of the season. He walked around it once, the same slow circle Daniel had walked the day he bought it. "Your grandfather would have hated the debt," Earl said, "but he respected a man who ran what he owned into the ground properly instead of babying it in the shed." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't quite pride either, but it was the closest thing to peace Daniel had gotten from his father in over a year, and he took it. The gap between his operation and the neighbors hadn't closed the way Daniel imagined it would that first triumphant week of planting. It had narrowed instead, through a season of setbacks on both sides, mechanical trouble that respected no brand, and a harvest that rewarded whoever recovered fastest rather than whoever started strongest. The bank's caution hadn't been proven wrong, but it hadn't been proven entirely right either. Daniel Voss didn't walk away from that season believing horsepower solves everything, and he didn't walk away believing his father's caution should have won the argument outright. He walked away with something harder to put on a bumper sticker. The debt was real, the risk was real, and the machine had done exactly what a machine can do: perform, break, and perform again, while the rest depended on a man's ability to absorb the difference between the season he planned for and the season he actually got. The Massey Ferguson sat in that shed all winter, paid for by a bet that hadn't paid off big and hadn't blown up either. Just held. Which, on 1,100 acres, in a year like that one, was its own kind of victory. Quiet, unglamorous, and the only kind Daniel Voss had ever really needed. Spring would come again soon enough, and with it another season, another set of unknowns, another chance for the machinery to prove itself or fail him at exactly the wrong hour. Daniel didn't know yet whether next year would finally deliver the payback his midnight math had promised, or whether it would demand another season of white-knuckle recovery like the one just behind him. What he did know, standing in that cold shed with his hand on the fender, the same way he'd touched it the day he signed for it, was that the choice was made now. There was no version of this story where he could go back and hand the loan officer's warning more weight than he had. There was only the version where he lived inside the bet he'd made, season after season, until the numbers either finally caught up to the dream or didn't. Either way, the Massey Ferguson would be the one carrying that answer into the ground next spring. Not the bank spreadsheet, not his father's caution, not the neighbor's fence line stare, just the machine, the man, and whatever the next season decided to throw at both of them. Daniel thought back, more than once that winter, to the parking lot the morning he signed, to the loan officer's flat, careful warning, to the word risky spoken out loud where anyone in the office could have heard it. He never resented Rick Halbrook for saying it. If anything, he respected him more for it. A man willing to put his real opinion on record instead of just processing a form and staying quiet. That, Daniel decided, was the real lesson underneath everything else. Not that the bank had been wrong, and not that he himself had been right, but that a serious decision deserves a serious warning. And a serious man takes that warning inside with him instead of dismissing it, even when he decides, in the end, to go through with it anyway. The Massey Ferguson would run again next spring, same as it had this year, same as it likely would for years after that. Whether it ever fully proved the bank wrong was almost beside the point by then. What it had proven, season after grinding season, was that Daniel Voss was the kind of man who could take a real risk, absorb a real setback, and still be standing in his own shed come winter with the land, the debt, and the machine all still in his name.